to take a look at the while we're considering the nature of sin, we're looking at questions numbers 17 and 18 this morning from the Catechism. The questions read as follows. Number 17, into what estate did the fall bring mankind? The answer is that the fall brought mankind into an estate of sin and misery. Question 18, wherein consists the sinfulness of that estate whereinto man fell? The answer is, the sinfulness of that estate whereinto man fell consists in the guilt of Adam's first sin, the want of original righteousness, and the corruption of his whole nature, which is commonly called original sin, together with all actual transgressions which proceed from it. So we are looking at the estate into which we enter into in view of Adam's fall into sin. There were consequences to Adam's sin. It did not simply affect him. I'm sorry, I got a couple people here coming in, so I think we got them here. So the consequences of Adam's sins were not just for himself or for he and Eve, but they were passed on to all of his descendants. So all of those who are obviously descended from Adam receive his sinful nature. That sinful nature includes a mind that has been corrupted, a will that has been set in bondage to sin, affections that have been polluted. Every aspect of our soul has been affected by Adam's sin. And so this is what the Catechism calls the estate in which we have fallen through Adam's sin. You might think of an estate like in estate planning. You have people who have a property, and it includes a home and landscaping and all the possessions within the home. That is their estate. Well, we inherit from Adam an estate, a living circumstance in which we find ourselves in. And in that estate, we have inherited Adam's sin. So the Catechism speaks of an estate of sin and misery. And so we'll consider the misery of the estate next time, Lord willing. But for now, we're just going to think on the sinfulness of that estate. So the sinfulness of his estate is first of all in the fact that he has received the guilt of Adam's first sin. Guilt is not simply a feeling that we have in reaction to something that we've done wrong, a sense that I have embarrassed myself, I have disappointed my friends, I have brought shame upon my name, these kinds of things that might contribute to my sense of guilt. But here there is a real guilt with regard to our relationship to God. And it's that guilt that the confession is speaking about here. The Catechism is speaking about. There's a real guilt whereby we are accountable to God for what we have done, and now we are subject to his wrath. And so our conscience speaks out against us for our sin. It is a witness against our sin, and it reflects the fact that we are guilty before God's law. We have broken that law, and so we are subject to it. And so this is the first thing that we don't often think about. We inherit the guilt of Adam's first sin. So when he ate of the forbidden fruit, we too, similarly, likewise, ate of that fruit. The guilt of that sin, in particular, of eating that fruit, is a guilt which has come down to us. We all participate in that original act of eating the forbidden fruit, and we all then inherit that guilt for sin. So you can think about all of the guilt that arises out of our own individual sins with every passing day. Thoughts, emotions, feelings, actions, words, what have you, bring sinfulness to us and guilt as well. But the Catechism reminds us that we inherit Adam's guilt first of all. And so even if it were possible to live a righteous and godly life in this world, free from sin, we still have the guilt of Adam's sin hanging over us. And of course, we cannot live a righteous, godly life. The scriptures will argue for just the opposite. I have some scriptures presented on the screen here, and let me see if I can get them up for you again. You have in Psalm 51, David, of course, reflecting on his own sin with Bathsheba, and it's a very powerful, moving psalm of confession before God. Against thee and thee only have I sinned, David begins the psalm with, and then here, in reflecting on his connection with sin, he sees the depths of sin within his own nature when he says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." And so here in the use of the Hebrew parallelism, you have David reflecting on the way in which sin is so deeply rooted in his life that it descends all the way back to the very origins and beginnings of life for him. All the way back to the time when he was born and took his first breath. With that first breath, he was a sinner. But then in the parallel clause here, David amplifies and accentuates the depths of his sin by saying that it adhered to him with regard to his very conception. Prior to his birth, while he was in the womb of his mother, he was qualified and tainted by sin. That sin, no doubt, is first of all Adam's sin that is passed on to us, and the guilt of that sin. And then also he receives from Adam a corrupt nature. So to cycle back for just a moment here on question 18 in the Shorter Catechism, in speaking of the guilt of Adam's first sin, there's also the want of original righteousness, or the lack of that original righteousness. So this is a reference to the fact that Adam was made good in God's sight and was able to do good things, and all the good things that he did were pleasing to God. That is gone from us. We have no righteousness now with Adam. There's no good works there that we participated in with Adam. We are corrupted by our sin. And so there's a loss of that original righteousness. We are filled with the original sin instead, and the whole of our nature is corrupted. Now, it's important that we appreciate the extent of sin's corruption in human nature. Some tend to think that, well, my mind can still think rationally and logically. I can reason things out from premises to conclusions, and so therefore I can make wise decisions. I can do good things, and as I am able to control my will with my intellect, then I can still do some good things. And indeed, many in evangelical communities, Arminian communities in particular, believe that man's will is morally neutral and is not tethered to a sinful nature, but is able to respond independently of sin, freely to God and his offer of grace. And that's simply not the case. If we take a look at the scriptures that are listed here in John 3 verse 6, we see that that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. So we are born of parents who have a sinful nature that they have inherited all the way back from Adam and Eve. And that comes to us today. And there's nothing that stands to break that transfer of that sinful nature to us. In Romans 3 verse 10 we read, as is written in the scriptures, none is righteous, no, not one. So even people who outwardly seem to live a good moral life, and we're going to talk about one today in Abimelech, nonetheless, they do not rise to the level of God's standard of righteousness in what they do. They fall far short of that standard of perfection. And so there's none righteous, no, not even one. No one is free to do good things on their own. And then Paul drives the point home in the 8th chapter of Romans when he says that the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. That is a very powerful, strong statement with regard to the nature of our sin. We are hostile to God, enemies of God by nature. We do not wish to submit to God in any way. And so any suggestion that we are morally neutral and we have a free will that can accept the offer of the gospel for salvation or reject it as we wish, it is not taking into account what Paul says here, that our nature, our will, our mind, everything is hostile, positively hostile to God, unwilling to submit to Him. And so we have this description of our human nature. It is corrupted through and through. It's not as evil as it could be, but it is tainted in every aspect of nature. And we see that day after day.